It all started last summer when the traveling carnival rolled into town. I hadn't been to one since I was a kid, so when my friends suggested going, I figured why not? Nostalgia, overpriced snacks, and cheesy rides seemed like a harmless way to spend the night. The carnival had the usual flair: flashing lights, screaming children, the faint aroma of fried food, and the eerie sound of carnival music drifting through the air. But there was something about this one that felt off. It's hard to explain, but the energy wasn't quite right. The workers didn't smile. They moved robotically, eyes glazed over like they were on autopilot. And the rides themselves groaned and squeaked like they were barely holding themselves together. I brushed it off at first. Carnivals are meant to feel a little creepy, right? But then I saw the funhouse. It wasn't the typical bright, colorful structure you'd expect. This one looked ancient, like it had been plucked straight out of a black and white horror film. Faded paint peeled off the walls, and its entrance was a gaping clown's mouth with chipped teeth and hollow eyes that seemed to follow you. A flickering neon sign above it read, "Laugh till you die." My friends laughed it off and dared me to go in. I wasn't scared of some rundown funhouse, so I agreed. I mean, it's just mirrors and cheap jump scares, right? But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. The first thing that hit me was the smell: musty, damp, with a hint of something metallic like blood. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the sound of distorted carnival music played faintly in the background. I turned to tell my friends, but they weren't there. They'd been right behind me, but now the entrance was gone. It was just a wall. I tried to push through, thinking it was a trick door, but it didn't budge. Panic bubbled up in my chest as I turned back toward the dark corridor. The dim, flickering lights made it hard to see, but I could make out rows of cracked mirrors lining the walls. My reflection was distorted, stretched, warped, like something out of a nightmare. As I moved deeper into the funhouse, I felt like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but then I saw it. One of the reflections wasn't mine. In the mirror ahead, a figure stood behind me. A tall man in a tattered suit, his face hidden behind an old-fashioned porcelain mask. I whipped around, but no one was there. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and echoing in the empty space. No response, just the faint sound of carnival music growing slower, more distorted. I tried to retrace my steps, but the mirrors seemed to close in around me. The corridor twisted and turned in impossible ways, like the funhouse was alive, reshaping itself to trap me. And then I started hearing it: soft laughter. At first, it was faint, almost playful, but it grew louder, more sinister, until it echoed all around me. It sounded like children, but there was something wrong with their voices. They were too high-pitched, too hollow, like they weren't real. And then I saw her. A little girl stood at the end of the hall, her back to me. She wore a tattered white dress stained with something dark. Her long hair was matted, and she held a cracked porcelain doll. "Hey," I called out, desperate for any human connection. "Are you lost too?" She didn't move. I took a step closer. "It's okay, I'm trying to get out of here too. We can..." She turned around and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. She let out a shrill, bone-chilling scream that made the mirrors around me shatter. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The laughter, the music, the screams, they all blurred together into a deafening cacophony as I stumbled through the maze. The shards of broken mirrors crunched under my feet, and with every step, I felt like something was chasing me. Finally, I burst into a new room, a circular chamber lined with warped mirrors. In the center stood a carousel, but instead of horses, it had grotesque figures. Twisted, human-like shapes with hollow eyes and gaping mouths frozen in silent screams. The carousel spun slowly, creaking with each rotation, and the lights above it flickered like they were on the verge of burning out. I didn't want to go near it, but the only exit was on the other side. As I edged around the room, trying to avoid the carousel, I felt the air grow colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then the carousel stopped. The figures turned their heads toward me in unison, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. One of them, a woman with a contorted face and a gaping wound across her throat, began to move. She reached out with skeletal hands, her fingers unnaturally long, and let out a guttural moan. I froze, paralyzed with fear as more of them started to come to life. They crawled off the carousel, their limbs bending in unnatural ways, and began dragging themselves toward me. Please, I screamed. I just want to get out of here. And then I saw him again, the man in the porcelain mask. He stood in the doorway, blocking my path, his head tilting to one side like he was studying me. Why are you doing this? I sobbed, backing away as the creatures closed in. What do you want? He didn't speak. He just raised a hand and pointed to the carousel. The lights flickered one last time and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was outside the funhouse, lying on the cold grass. My friends were standing over me, their faces pale and confused. Where the hell were you? One of them asked. We've been looking for you for hours. I tried to explain, but they didn't believe me. They said they'd waited for me at the entrance, but I never came out. They thought I'd bailed and went to look for me around the carnival. No one remembered the funhouse. When I turned back to point it out, it was gone. Just an empty patch of grass where it had been. I haven't been to a carnival since, and I never will. Sometimes late at night, I hear the faint sound of distorted carnival music, and I swear I catch glimpses of a porcelain mask in the corner of my eye.
Story number 2.
The carnival arrived unannounced, as it always did, creeping into town like a shadow at dusk. It wasn't listed in any flyers or advertised on social media. One day it was just there, set up on the outskirts of town in a desolate field, the bright lights and eerie music luring people in like moths to a flame. I wasn't planning to go, but my sister Emma begged me to take her. She was only 10, and Mom worked nights, so I caved. It wasn't like I believed the rumors anyway, the whispers about people who disappeared after visiting, about the carnival that wasn't supposed to exist. When we got there, the first thing I noticed was how fake it all felt. The rides looked cobbled together, rusted and unsafe. The workers didn't talk. They just stood motionless, faces hidden behind grotesque masks. Clowns, animals, and strange, unrecognizable creatures. Even their costumes were off, too realistic, as if the fur and scales weren't fabric but skin. Let's go to the Ferris wheel, Emma squealed, tugging at my arm. I forced a smile, trying to hide my unease. Sure, but just one ride, okay? The Ferris wheel was massive, towering over the carnival like a skeletal giant. Its carriages swayed in the wind, creaking ominously, but Emma didn't seem to notice. She ran ahead, and a tall figure in a wolf mask stepped forward to let her in. His movements were jerky, almost mechanical, and his eyes, hidden behind dark slits, seemed to follow me. 2 tickets, he rasped. His voice sounded wrong, like static mixed with gravel. I handed him the tickets, and he opened the gate with a slow, deliberate motion. Emma climbed in, her excitement dimming as the carriage door slammed shut behind her. I was about to follow when the wolfman blocked my path. Only one at a time, he growled. What? No way. She's a kid. I'm going with her. He didn't respond, just tilted his head and gestured toward the line of people waiting behind me. Except when I turned, there was no line, just empty darkness stretching beyond the carnival's edge. Before I could argue, the wheel jerked to life, creaking and groaning as it ascended. Emma waved down at me, but something about her expression seemed off. Her smile was too wide, her movements stiff. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The wheel spun once, twice, and then stopped. Emma's carriage was at the very top, swaying gently in the breeze. I expected her to scream in protest or wave for help, but she just sat there, staring straight ahead. Bring her down, I shouted at the wolfman, but he ignored me, his gaze fixed on the Ferris wheel, and then the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went pitch black, and when the lights returned, Emma's carriage was empty. I screamed her name, running toward the wheel, but the wolfman grabbed my arm with an unnatural strength. His hand was cold, almost lifeless, and when I looked up, his mask had shifted. The eyes that stared back weren't human. They were yellow and glowing, like a predator's. Where is she? I demanded, yanking my arm free. She is where they all go, he said, his voice echoing like it came from deep within a cavern. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted toward the wheel, climbing the metal supports, ignoring the jagged edges that cut into my palms. When I reached Emma's carriage, it was empty, but the seat was wet, sticky, like blood, and a faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I climbed higher, desperate to see where she had gone, and that's when I noticed the shadows. Below me, the carnival had changed. The lights were dimmer, the rides twisted and unrecognizable. The carousel horses were no longer wooden. They were flesh, their eyes rolling wildly in their sockets as they screamed. The workers' masks had fused to their faces, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they moved among the rides. And the people, the carnival goers, they weren't people anymore. They shuffled aimlessly, their faces blank and featureless, as if their identities had been erased. "Emma!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with panic. A laugh echoed behind me, low and guttural. I turned and nearly lost my grip. The wolfman was climbing the wheel, his limbs bending at impossible angles, his mask shifting and morphing into something grotesque. "You shouldn't have come," he hissed, his voice distorting with each word. "She belongs to us now, and so do you." I scrambled down, slipping on the blood-slicked metal, my heart pounding in my chest. When I hit the ground, I ran, past the grotesque carousel, past the distorted faces of the workers, and toward the exit. But the closer I got, the more the carnival seemed to stretch. The lights dimmed further, the music slowing to a sinister drone, and the exit gate was nowhere in sight. Something brushed against my arm, and I turned to see Emma standing there. Her dress was torn, her hair matted, and her eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that oozed black ichor. "Emma," I whispered, my voice trembling. She smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like a predator baring its teeth. "You came back for me," she said, her voice layered with something else, something older and malevolent. I stumbled backward, but she grabbed my wrist with a strength that didn't belong to a 10-year-old. Her grip burned like fire, and when I looked down, her fingers were clawed, her nails digging into my skin. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing with laughter. "No one leaves." I screamed and yanked my arm free, stumbling into one of the carnival tents. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and the walls were lined with mirrors. Each reflection showed a version of myself, twisted, broken, dead. In the center of the tent stood a figure in a jester's outfit, its face painted with a grin that stretched far too wide. Its eyes glowed yellow, and its voice slithered through the air like poison. "Welcome to the show," it said, spreading its arms wide. I don't remember how I escaped. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the middle of the field, the carnival gone. My hands were bloody, my clothes torn, and Emma was nowhere to be found. The police searched for days, but there was no trace of her. They said I must have imagined it, that the carnival never existed. But I know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of carnival music drifting on the wind, and when I close my eyes, I see Emma's face, her empty sockets staring back at me. I'll never stop looking for her, but deep down, I know I'll never find her. The carnival took her, just like it's taken so many others, and one day I know it will come back for me.
Story number 3.
It started with the flyers. Bright, garish colors slapped onto telephone poles, bus stops, and fences. The Carnival of Shadows, one night only. They seemed to appear overnight, and by morning, the entire town was buzzing about it. Nobody knew who organized it or how they set up so quickly, but nobody questioned it either. Small towns like ours rarely got excitement, so when something new arrived, everyone showed up. I wasn't planning to go. I wasn't one for crowds, and something about the name, the Carnival of Shadows, felt wrong. But my best friend Jared was relentless. "Come on, Mia," he said, his voice practically a whine. "It's just one night. We'll grab some funnel cake, maybe ride the Ferris wheel, and call it a night." Reluctantly, I agreed. When we arrived, the carnival looked off. The rides were old and creaky, the colors muted under the dim glow of string lights. The air smelled faintly of burned sugar and something metallic. People milled about, but their faces were wrong, too pale, their smiles frozen in unnatural grins. "I don't like this," I muttered as we walked through the gates. "Don't be such a buzzkill," Jared said, already eyeing the food stands. The first thing we tried was the House of Mirrors. It was Jared's idea. He wanted to see if the place lived up to the creepy vibe he claimed it had. The worker at the entrance was dressed like a clown, but his makeup was smudged and his eyes looked tired. "Don't stray from the path," he muttered as we handed over our tickets. Jared laughed it off, but I felt a chill. Inside, the mirrors twisted our reflections into grotesque versions of ourselves. Jared found it hilarious, making faces and laughing at his distorted image. But as we ventured deeper, the laughter faded. "Hey, Mia," he called. "Check this out." I turned to where he was pointing. One of the mirrors wasn't reflecting us. It showed a dark, empty room. "That's weird," I said, stepping closer. As I peered into the mirror, the scene shifted. A figure stood in the center of the room, its back to us. It was tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed too fragile to support its weight. "What the hell?" Jared whispered. The figure turned. Its face, or lack of one, made my stomach churn. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over its skull. Jared grabbed my arm. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the path had changed. The mirrors formed a maze, and no matter which way we went, we couldn't find the exit. Worse, the figure from the mirror began appearing in every reflection, closer each time. Jared was the first to see it behind us. "Run!" he shouted, yanking me down a narrow corridor. The thing followed, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. The sound it made, like nails scraping against glass, echoed around us, drowning out my panicked breaths. Finally, we burst through the exit, stumbling into the cool night air. The clown at the entrance was gone, and the crowd outside didn't seem to notice our terror. "Let's just go home," I pleaded, but Jared shook his head. "No way, we're fine. It was just part of the attraction, right?" I didn't believe him, but I followed him deeper into the carnival. The next ride we tried was the Ferris wheel. Jared insisted, saying it would help us calm down. The operator was an old man with a milky eye and a crooked grin. "One ride?" he rasped, his voice like dead leaves crunching underfoot. We climbed into the carriage, and the wheel began to turn. At first, it was peaceful, the carnival shrinking below us into a kaleidoscope of lights. But as we reached the top, the wheel stopped. "Great," Jared muttered. "Probably broke down." I glanced at the other carriages and froze. They were empty. "Where's everyone?" I whispered. The lights below began to flicker, and the sounds of the carnival grew faint, replaced by an oppressive silence. In the distance, something moved. A shadow, impossibly large, slithering toward us. The carriage shook violently, and I grabbed Jared's arm. "We need to get off this thing." The shadow reached the base of the Ferris wheel, rising up like a tidal wave. It had no discernible form, just a mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe. As it climbed the wheel, tendrils of shadow snaked toward us. "Jump!" Jared shouted, kicking open the door of the carriage. We leapt, landing hard on the gravel below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to run. Jared pulled me to my feet, and we stumbled toward the exit. But the exit wasn't there. The carnival had changed. The rides were twisted, grotesque versions of themselves. The carousel horses were skeletal, their hollow eyes glowing red. The game booths were abandoned, their prizes decayed and rotting. And the people, they weren't people anymore. Their faces were blank, their movements stiff like marionettes on invisible strings. "We have to find a way out," Jared said, his voice shaking. We ducked into a tent, hoping to hide. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Rows of cages lined the walls, each one holding something wrong. A woman with no eyes, her mouth stretched into a permanent scream. A child with too many arms, its fingers twitching unnaturally. "What is this place?" I whispered. Jared didn't answer. He was staring at one of the cages, his face pale. Inside was a mirror, and in its reflection I saw us, broken, twisted versions of ourselves. "No," I breathed, backing away. The mirror began to crack, and the reflection stepped out. It wasn't us, not exactly. Their eyes were empty, their skin pale and waxy, but their movements, they mirrored ours perfectly. "Run!" Jared screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The reflections closed in, their faces twisting into grotesque parodies of ours. Just as they reached us, the lights went out. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the field where the carnival had been. Jared was gone, and the field was empty, save for a single flyer fluttering in the breeze. The police didn't believe me. They said the carnival never existed, that Jared probably just ran away. But I know the truth. Sometimes I hear the music in the distance, faint and haunting, and when I look in the mirror, I swear my reflection isn't mine.
Story number 4.
I always thought of myself as a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and anything supernatural, none of it fazed me. But that changed last summer when I took a job as a groundskeeper at an old amusement park. It wasn't an ordinary park. The place had been shut down for over 40 years after a tragic accident on its most infamous ride, the Whirlwind. The locals whispered about the place, calling it cursed. But to me, it was just a job. Easy money for mowing overgrown grass and clearing out debris. My first day was uneventful. The park was exactly what I expected: rusting rides, faded paint, and nature reclaiming the land. It was eerie, sure, but not in a way that scared me. It just felt sad, like the remnants of a dream long forgotten. Then I found the carousel. It stood in the heart of the park, untouched by time. The paint was vivid, the horses gleamed, and the lights on the canopy sparkled like stars. It didn't make sense. Everything else in the park was decaying, yet the carousel looked as if it had been freshly polished. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer. A faint tune played, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. I told myself it was just the wind, though deep down I knew better. That night, as I locked up, I couldn't stop thinking about the carousel. I decided to take another look before leaving. When I approached, the music was louder this time, and the carousel was moving. It shouldn't have been. There was no power in the park, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. The horses bobbed up and down in perfect rhythm, their eyes glinting in the dim moonlight. I froze. My first instinct was to run, but something kept me rooted in place. As I watched, the horses' movements slowed and the carousel came to a stop. Then, one of the horses turned its head. It was subtle, just a slight tilt, but I saw it. The horse's lifeless eyes seemed to lock onto mine, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I backed away, my breath quickening, and turned to leave. But as I did, I heard it. "Stay." The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it was there. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the carousel was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the creepy atmosphere get to me. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I returned to the park, there was something new. A teddy bear sat on the carousel. It was old and worn, its fur matted and one button eye missing. I hadn't seen it there before. I ignored it and went about my work, but no matter where I was in the park, I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance toward the carousel, and the bear would seem closer. By the end of the day, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the bear, intending to throw it into the trash, but as soon as I touched it, I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my wrist. I dropped the bear and stumbled back, my heart pounding. The bear landed upright, its single eye fixed on me. That night, I dreamed of the park. The carousel spun wildly, its horses screeching as their painted mouths twisted into grotesque grins. Children's laughter echoed through the air, but it wasn't joyful. It was mocking, sinister. When I woke up, my wrist was bruised. I told my boss about the strange things happening, but he just laughed it off. "You're letting the ghost stories get to you," he said. Still, he agreed to let me take the day off. I stayed home trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me, but the park wouldn't let me go. That night, I heard the music again. It was faint but unmistakable, the same haunting melody from the carousel. It shouldn't have been possible. I was miles away from the park. I tried to ignore it, but the music grew louder, more insistent. And then I heard the voice again. "Come back." I don't know why I went. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else. Something I couldn't fight. Either way, I found myself driving to the park in the middle of the night. The gates were open when I arrived, though I knew I'd locked them. The carousel was spinning, its lights casting eerie shadows across the park. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The teddy bear was back, sitting on one of the horses. This time I didn't touch it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The music stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a little girl, no older than 8, wearing a tattered dress and clutching a balloon. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. "Do you want to ride?" she asked, her voice sweet but cold. I shook my head, taking a step back. The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You can't leave," she said. "Not until you ride." Before I could react, the carousel roared to life. The horses moved frantically, their painted faces twisting into snarls. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, falling onto the grass. When I looked up, the girl was standing over me, her balloon floating just above my face. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered. Her face began to change, her features melting away like wax. Her eyes grew larger, darker, until they consumed her entire face. Her mouth stretched into a gaping void, and from it came a sound, a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the growl echoing behind me. The park seemed to stretch on forever, the rides looming over me like sentinels. Finally, I reached the exit. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel. I quit the job the next day. I didn't give an explanation, and I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. But the park didn't let me go. Sometimes I hear the music when I'm alone, and when I close my eyes, I see her, the girl with the balloon, waiting for me to come back.
Story number 5.
I should have listened to the warnings. Every small town has its local legends, its whispered tales meant to keep kids from wandering too far. Ours was about the Midnight Carnival. It was said to appear without warning, an eerie collection of tents, rides, and booths in the middle of the woods. The legend claimed it only arrived once a decade, but no one who entered ever came back the same. Some vanished entirely, while others were found wandering the woods days later, muttering nonsense with blank, haunted eyes. I never believed the stories. They sounded like something parents made up to keep their kids from sneaking out at night. But last fall, I found out the truth. It started when my friend Kyle convinced me to join him on a midnight hike. He was always chasing the next thrill, and I was always tagging along, partly because I didn't want to look like a coward. We met at the edge of the woods just before midnight, flashlights in hand. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes the world feel eerily quiet. I heard someone saw lights out here last night, Kyle said as we walked. Maybe we'll find something cool. I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. It was just another one of his wild ideas. About half an hour into the hike, we saw it, a faint glow in the distance, flickering like firelight. As we got closer, the air grew heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but Kyle was already moving ahead, his curiosity outweighing any sense of caution. When we reached the clearing, I froze. The midnight carnival was real. Brightly colored tents stood in a perfect circle, their fabric shimmering unnaturally in the moonlight. A towering Ferris wheel loomed over the scene, its lights blinking in a slow, hypnotic pattern. The air was filled with the sound of distant laughter and carnival music, but there was no one in sight. "This is insane," Kyle whispered, his voice tinged with awe. I wanted to leave. Every fiber of my being told me we didn't belong there. But Kyle was already moving toward the nearest tent, and I felt compelled to follow. The first booth we approached had a sign that read, "Win a prize!" Behind the counter stood a man dressed in an old-fashioned ringmaster's outfit. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his smile stretched just a little too wide. "Step right up," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. "Test your luck." Kyle grinned, reaching into his pocket for $1. But the man shook his head. "No money needed. Just a drop of blood." "What?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The man gestured to a small needle on the counter. "A tiny prick, that's all. In exchange, you might win something truly extraordinary." Kyle hesitated, glancing at me. I shook my head, but he laughed it off. "It's just a gimmick," he said, pricking his finger before I could stop him. The man handed Kyle a small ticket and gestured toward a spinning wheel behind the booth. Kyle gave it a spin, and the arrow landed on a red section marked with a gold star. "Congratulations," the man exclaimed, pulling a box from beneath the counter. Kyle opened it to reveal a silver pocket watch. It was intricately designed, its surface etched with swirling patterns. "Cool," Kyle said, slipping it into his pocket. But as we walked away, I noticed the way the man watched us. His smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold, calculating. We explored more of the carnival, though I refused to play any of the games. Each booth seemed designed to lure you in with promises of incredible prizes, but there was always a catch. A drop of blood, a strand of hair, or a whispered secret. The people running the booths were all unsettlingly similar. They moved with an unnatural grace, their smiles too perfect, their eyes too knowing. The longer we stayed, the more I felt like the carnival was alive, watching us, waiting. Then we found the mirror maze. Kyle insisted on going inside, despite my protests. The maze was dark and disorienting, the mirrors reflecting not just our images but something else. Shadows that didn't belong, flickers of movement that vanished when I turned my head. Halfway through, I lost Kyle. I called his name, my voice echoing eerily in the narrow corridors, but there was no response. The mirrors began to shift, the reflections warping until they no longer looked like me. My face stretched and twisted, my eyes wide with terror. Panicking, I turned a corner and stumbled into a dead end. That's when I saw him. A figure stood behind the glass, dressed in a black suit with a featureless white mask. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt his presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. I ran, the maze twisting around me in ways that defied logic. It felt like hours before I finally burst out into the open air, gasping for breath. Kyle was waiting for me by the Ferris wheel, but something was wrong. His skin was pale, his eyes glassy. He didn't speak as I approached, just stared at me with a vacant expression. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded slowly but didn't say a word. "Let's get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm. As we made our way back to the woods, I noticed the carnival lights flickering. The music grew louder, more distorted, like a broken record. When we reached the tree line, I turned back for one last look. The carnival was gone. Kyle didn't speak the entire way home. He just stared out the window, clutching the pocket watch. Over the next few days, his condition worsened. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his phone. When I visited him, his apartment was dark, the windows covered with thick blankets. He was sitting in the corner, the watch in his hands. "It won't stop ticking," he whispered. I didn't hear anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't lying. The last time I saw Kyle, he was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken. He handed me the pocket watch and said, "Take it back." I didn't know what he meant, but I took the watch hoping it might help him. That night, I dreamed of the carnival. The ringmaster was there, his smile wider than ever. "We've been expecting you," he said, gesturing toward the Ferris wheel. I woke up with the watch in my hand, its ticking filling the room. I don't know what's happening, but I can feel the carnival pulling me back. The watch won't stop ticking, and every night the dreams get worse. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever see the lights in the woods, don't go near them. The Midnight Carnival doesn't just take your blood or your secrets, it takes you.
Story number 6.
I've always loved small-town festivals. There's something charming about the food stalls, the cheap carnival games, and the cheerful chaos of people coming together. That's why when my girlfriend, Erin, suggested we check out the Willow Creek Carnival during a weekend road trip, I didn't hesitate. Willow Creek was one of those blink-and-you-miss-it towns. The main street was lined with faded buildings, and the locals seemed friendly enough, waving at us as we drove in. The carnival was set up in a large field just outside of town, its lights glittering like a beacon against the darkening sky. From the moment we stepped onto the ground, something felt off. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a strange smell I couldn't place. Sweet, like candy, but with an underlying staleness. The rides looked older than they should have, with peeling paint and rusted bolts. The workers, dressed in mismatched uniforms, moved with a sluggishness that didn't match the lively music playing from the speakers. Erin didn't seem to notice. She was all smiles, dragging me toward a booth where you could win a stuffed animal by knocking over milk bottles. "Let's try it," she said, handing me $1. I threw the ball, and the bottles barely wobbled. The carny behind the booth grinned, his teeth sharp and too white against his weathered face. "Almost, buddy," he said, pushing the ball back to me. I tried again, but the bottles didn't budge. "Rigged," I muttered, and Erin laughed, pulling me toward the Ferris wheel. The ride operator didn't speak as he helped us into the gondola. His eyes, sunken and dark, seemed to watch us a little too closely. As the wheel creaked to life, the view from the top was breathtaking, the carnival lights stretching out like a web against the night. But when I looked down, I noticed something strange. The crowd below wasn't moving. At first, I thought they were just standing still, maybe watching a performance. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't people at all. They were mannequins. "Erin," I said, my voice shaking. "What?" "Look down." She leaned over the edge and froze. "What the hell?" The ride stopped suddenly, jerking us forward. The operator was gone, his booth empty. "Stay calm," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We'll get off when it starts moving again." But it didn't. Minutes passed and the air grew colder. I could hear the creaking of the Ferris wheel, but no music, no voices, nothing else. Then, from below, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I looked down to see a figure walking among the mannequins. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face was blank, just smooth, pale skin where features should have been. Erin grabbed my arm. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered. The figure stopped at the base of the Ferris wheel and tilted its head as if looking up at us, and then it started climbing. Its movements were jerky but fast, hands gripping the metal beams with an unnatural strength. "Climb out," I shouted, pushing open the gondola door. Erin hesitated, but the sight of the thing scrambling toward us spurred her into action. We climbed onto the frame of the Ferris wheel, our hands slipping on the cold, damp metal. We made it to the central axis just as the thing reached our gondola. It paused, tilting its head again before continuing its ascent. "We have to jump," I said, looking at the ground below. It wasn't far, but it wasn't close either. Erin nodded, her face pale. Together, we leapt. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled to my feet, pulling Erin up. We ran, weaving through the booths and rides, the sound of creaking metal and heavy footsteps close behind. "Over here," a voice hissed. I turned to see a man standing near the funhouse, waving us toward him. He was older, with a scruffy beard and wild eyes. "No," Erin said, pulling me in the opposite direction. "We can't trust him." But the thing was gaining on us, its elongated limbs carrying it closer with each stride. "Come on," the man shouted. With no other choice, we followed him into the funhouse. The air inside was musty, and the mirrors lining the walls distorted our reflections into grotesque shapes. The man led us through a maze of corridors, his pace relentless. "What is that thing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer until we reached a hidden door at the back of the funhouse. He pushed it open, revealing a dark staircase leading underground. "No time," he said, motioning us inside. We descended into a dimly lit room filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. The man locked the door behind us and turned to face us. "That thing isn't human," he said. "It's part of the carnival." "What do you mean, part of the carnival?" Aaron demanded. "This place," he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "It's cursed. Everyone who comes here becomes part of it eventually. The workers, the mannequins, even the rides, they're all people who got trapped." "That's insane," I said. "Is it?" He snapped, pointing to a photo on the wall. It showed a group of smiling carnival workers, their faces frozen in black and white cheerfulness. My blood ran cold when I recognized the Ferris wheel operator among them. "We need to get out of here," Erin said, her voice shaking. The man shook his head. "There's no way out. The carnival won't let you leave." As if on cue, the lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the staircase. "It's here," the man whispered. The thing burst through the door, its blank face now twisted into a grotesque grin. "Run!" the man shouted, throwing himself at the creature. We didn't look back. We tore through the funhouse, the walls seeming to close in around us. When we finally burst outside, the carnival was silent. The lights were out, the booths and rides abandoned. "Where is everyone?" Aaron whispered. I didn't answer. We ran to the car and sped away, the town disappearing into the rearview mirror. We didn't stop until we were miles away, and even then we didn't feel safe. Later, I looked up Willow Creek Carnival online. There were no recent records of it, just an old article from the 1950s about a fire that destroyed the entire carnival, killing dozens of people. The faces in the accompanying photo were eerily familiar.
Story number 7.
There's a strange freedom in living alone, especially in a new city. No one to bother you, no expectations. It was exactly what I needed after breaking with my boyfriend of 4 years. I found a small, older apartment on the edge of town, cheap enough for me to afford on my own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The day I moved in, my upstairs neighbor introduced himself. He was an older man named Mr. Grayson with gray hair and a cane he leaned on heavily. He seemed friendly, asking if I needed help with my boxes and chatting about how quiet the building was. "It's an easy place to live," he said, his voice gravely. "Just stay out of the basement." I laughed, assuming he was joking. "Why? Monsters?" His expression didn't change. "Just don't go down there." That night, as I unpacked, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. I wasn't one to be easily scared, but his tone unsettled me. Still, I shook it off. The building was old, and old people always had weird quirks about stuff like that. For the first few weeks, things were uneventful. I went to work, came home, and slowly settled into my new life. Mr. Grayson was right. The building was quiet. Almost too quiet. It was late one night when I first noticed something strange. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard faint footsteps above me. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I sat up, confused. Mr. Grayson had told me he rarely moved around at night because of his bad leg. The footsteps stopped, and I convinced myself it was just the old building creaking. The next morning, I ran into him in the hallway. "Were you up late last night?" I asked casually. He frowned. "I don't get up at night." "Why?" I hesitated. "I thought I heard footsteps, probably just the pipes or something." He didn't reply, but his expression darkened. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, more erratic. They moved quickly, crossing the ceiling in sharp bursts. It sounded like someone was running. I grabbed a broom and banged on the ceiling. "Hey, some of us are trying to sleep." The footsteps stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then a soft tapping started. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and directly above my bed. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, clutching the broom, my heart racing. The tapping continued for what felt like hours before stopping suddenly. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Grayson, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I asked the landlord about him and learned something that made my stomach drop. Mr. Grayson had died 2 days earlier. I stared at the landlord in disbelief. "That's not possible. I just talked to him yesterday." The landlord shook his head. "He had a heart attack in his apartment. Quiet guy. No family. We only found him because of the smell." I felt sick. If Mr. Grayson was dead, Who had I spoken to? And more importantly, who or what was making the noises upstairs? That night, I locked every door and window. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. At exactly 3 a.m., the footsteps started again. This time, they weren't confined to the ceiling. They moved down the walls, heavy and deliberate, as if someone was crawling. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. "There's someone in the building," I whispered. He sounded groggy. "It's an old place, probably just the pipes." "No," I insisted. "It's footsteps. They're moving." He sighed. "I'll check it out in the morning." I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, clutching a kitchen knife, listening to the sounds until dawn. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and started looking for hotels. But before I left, curiosity got the better of me. I remembered Mr. Grayson's warning about the basement. The entrance was at the end of the hall, behind a heavy metal door. I hesitated before opening it, the stale air hitting me like a wave. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow, the light flickering overhead. I stepped cautiously, my heart pounding with every creak of the wooden stairs. The basement was empty, just rows of storage lockers and a dirt floor. But then I saw it. In the far corner, something was scratched into the wall, words written over and over, so deeply that the plaster had crumbled away. "Leave now, before it finds you." A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the basement into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, the small beam of its flashlight cutting through the shadows. That's when I heard it, breathing. It was soft at first, like someone exhaling slowly. Then it grew louder, raspy and uneven, coming from just behind me. I spun around, the light trembling in my hand. There was nothing there. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The breathing stopped, and then a low growl echoed through the basement. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard, the phone skidding out of my hand. When I looked up, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the light, its body hunched and contorted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, empty voids. It moved toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally, as if it didn't know how to walk. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and bolting up the stairs. The door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. The thing was close now, its ragged breathing filling my ears. In a moment of desperation, I threw myself against the door, and it burst open. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away from the building as fast as I could. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, my furniture, my clothes, even my photos. Sometimes I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. Slow, deliberate, and always getting closer.
Story number 8.
It began with a dare. Isn't that how these stories always start? A foolish, reckless dare among friends, fueled by late-night boredom and too much cheap beer. This one was simple. Stay the night in the old Garrison house. Everyone in town knew the stories. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to rot on the edge of the woods. The Garrison family had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the 1970s, leaving dinner plates still on the table and lights burning in every room. Theories ranged from a botched robbery to alien abduction, but nothing was ever proven. Now the house stood as a crumbling monument to fear, boarded up and forgotten. My friend Jake, ever the instigator, grinned at me across the fire pit that night. "Come on, man. You're always talking about how ghosts aren't real. Prove it. Stay the night. We'll even drop you off and pick you up at dawn." I laughed, but my stomach twisted. I wasn't superstitious, but the idea of spending a night alone in that house felt wrong. Still, pride won out. "Fine, but you better be there at sunrise. I'm not walking home." By midnight, I stood at the edge of the overgrown driveway, flashlight in hand. The house loomed before me, its windows like empty eye sockets staring into the night. Jake and the others hollered from the car as they sped away, leaving me alone with my decision. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The boards over the entrance had been pried loose, likely by other thrill-seekers over the years. I pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly, as if protesting my intrusion. Inside, the air was heavy and damp. My flashlight swept over the walls, revealing peeling wallpaper and water stains. The furniture was still there, draped in dusty sheets that looked like forgotten ghosts themselves. A chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and clouded. I chose the living room to settle in for the night. It felt like the safest spot, with a clear view of the front door. I unfolded my sleeping bag on the sagging couch and tried to get comfortable. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The house creaked and groaned, settling in the cool night air, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. At around 2 a.m., I began to hear it, a faint scratching noise coming from upstairs. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just an animal. Raccoons or squirrels could easily have gotten inside over the years. Still, I couldn't ignore the sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if something or someone was dragging their nails along the floorboards. I shone my flashlight toward the staircase, the beam barely piercing the darkness beyond. "Hello?" My voice echoed through the empty house, small and uncertain. The scratching stopped. I told myself not to go upstairs, but curiosity or stupidity won. Clutching the flashlight like a weapon, I climbed the stairs, each step groaning loudly under my weight. The air grew colder as I reached the second floor, my breath visible in the beam of light. The hallway stretched before me, lined with doors on either side. The scratching started again, louder this time, coming from the farthest room on the left. I crept forward, the sound growing sharper, more urgent. The door to the room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with trembling fingers, my flashlight revealing a bedroom frozen in time. A four-poster bed stood in the center, the covers neatly made. A vanity sat against the wall, its mirror cracked and fogged. But it was the closet door that held my attention. It was open just a sliver, enough for the scratching sound to escape. "Jake, if this is you, I swear to God." My voice cracked as I inched toward the closet. I reached out, my hand shaking, and yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty, save for a few wire hangers swaying gently. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the wall of the closet, carved deeply into the wood, was a single word: "Run." The relief evaporated. The air felt heavier, suffocating. I backed out of the room, my flashlight flickering. And then I heard it. A faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike, coming from behind me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a small figure standing in the hallway. A girl, no older than 10, with matted hair and a tattered dress. Her eyes reflected the light unnaturally, like an animal's. She tilted her head, her lips stretching into an unnatural smile. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my hands, spinning wildly on the floor and casting frantic shadows on the walls. When I scrambled to grab it, she was gone. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door seemed farther away than it had been, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Just as I reached the door, it slammed shut in my face, as if an unseen force was holding it closed. I yanked on the handle, my palms slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the giggle came again, this time closer. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on the chandelier, which was swaying gently, though there was no breeze. Then the sound of footsteps began. Slow, deliberate, descending the stairs. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. I threw myself against the door, screaming, until it finally gave way. I tumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. The night was eerily silent, the woods around the house still as death. I didn't look back as I ran down the driveway and into the road, my heart pounding in my ears. I kept running until I saw the headlights of Jake's car. He rolled down the window, grinning. "What happened? You look like you've seen a... drive," I screamed, throwing myself into the car. Jake's smile faltered and he hit the gas. As we sped away, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the second-floor window, the little girl stood watching, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I never went back to the Garrison house.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just me and my best friend Leah. We had planned it for months, a chance to escape the monotony of work and responsibilities. Our goal was to drive through a string of small towns, stopping at roadside attractions and enjoying the freedom of the open road. We were halfway through Missouri when we saw the sign, "Carnival of Nightmares, one night only." It was crudely painted, with a grinning clown face and an arrow pointing down a narrow dirt road. Leah was instantly intrigued. "Let's check it out," she said, her excitement infectious. I hesitated. The whole setup seemed off. But Leah had already turned down the road before I could protest. The dirt path twisted and turned, the trees overhead forming an almost impenetrable canopy. By the time we arrived, the sky was dark and a faint mist clung to the ground. The carnival appeared suddenly, its neon lights flickering in the gloom. It wasn't like any carnival I'd seen before. The rides were old, rusted, and creaking with every movement. The booths were manned by strange, silent figures who watched us with unblinking eyes. Despite the eerie atmosphere, a surprising number of people were there, wandering aimlessly through the grounds. Leah, ever the adventurer, grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a ticket booth. The man inside was gaunt, his face pale and sunken. He slid 2 tickets across the counter without a word. "What's the theme?" Leah asked, trying to make conversation. His lips curled into a faint smile. "Survival," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of gimmick, and entered the carnival. The first ride we tried was the Ferris wheel. It looked ancient, with chipped paint and groaning metal, but Leah insisted. As the wheel began to turn, I felt an odd sensation, as though the air around us was charged. When we reached the top, I looked out over the carnival grounds. That's when I noticed something strange. The people below weren't moving normally. Their motions were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes on invisible strings. And their faces were blank, devoid of expression. I nudged Leah, but when I turned to speak, her face was pale. She had noticed it too. We got off the ride as quickly as we could, our laughter replaced by unease. "Let's just do one more thing and go," I suggested, my voice trembling. Leah nodded, her excitement tempered by the strange atmosphere. We wandered until we found a funhouse. Its entrance was a gaping clown mouth, its teeth jagged and yellow. "Last one," Leah said, forcing a smile. Inside, the funhouse was a maze of mirrors. The air was cold and our footsteps echoed unnaturally. At first, we laughed nervously at our distorted reflections, but the laughter died when the reflections stopped matching our movements. I froze, staring at the mirror in front of me. My reflection was smiling, even though I wasn't. Slowly, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass. "Leah," I whispered, not daring to move. She turned, and I heard her gasp. In her mirror, her reflection was crying, its eyes wide with terror. We backed away from the mirrors, bumping into each other. The reflections didn't follow. They stayed in place, watching us with eerie precision. We ran, desperate to find the exit, but the funhouse seemed to stretch on forever. The walls twisted and shifted, and every path we took led us back to the same room. Panic set in. "This isn't normal," I said, my voice cracking. Leah grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here, now." That's when the laughter started. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a high-pitched, maniacal giggle that echoed through the funhouse. "Who's there?" Leah shouted, her voice shaking. The laughter didn't answer. Instead, the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. When they came back on, the mirrors were gone. We were in a long hallway with no doors or windows. At the end of the hall stood a figure, its face obscured by shadow. It began to move toward us, its footsteps slow and deliberate. "Run," Leah whispered, and we took off in the opposite direction. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the figure's footsteps growing louder with every second. My chest burned and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, we burst through a door and found ourselves back outside. The carnival was eerily quiet now, the lights dim and flickering. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing Leah's hand. We ran toward the parking lot, but the car wasn't there. In its place was an old rusted truck, its windows shattered. "What the hell?" Leah whispered, panic in her voice. A voice behind us made us freeze. "Leaving so soon?" We turned to see the ticket booth man, his pale face split by a sinister grin. "What do you want?" I demanded. His grin widened. "The carnival chooses who stays. And you're just too much fun to let go." We didn't wait to hear more. We sprinted past him, heading for the woods. The trees closed in around us, the mist thickening with every step. Behind us, we could hear the laughter again, closer this time. The woods were disorienting, every tree looking the same. We stumbled and fell, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Just when I thought we'd never escape, we broke through the tree line and onto the main road. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. We flagged it down, waving frantically. The driver, a middle-aged man, rolled down the window. "You kids okay?" We climbed into the car, shaking and out of breath. As he drove us back to town, we glanced back at the woods. The carnival was gone. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The authorities found no trace of the carnival or the people who attended it. But sometimes late at night, I hear that laughter again, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. I've learned one thing since then. Some attractions aren't meant to be visited.
Story number 10.
It was supposed to be just another Saturday night. The carnival rolled into town every year like clockwork, bringing its neon lights and whirling rides to the dusty old fairgrounds. My friends and I were drawn to it, not for the cotton candy or the games, but for the thrill, the strange, almost forbidden energy the carnival seemed to carry. It was the kind of place that felt alive, like it had a personality of its own. But this time, it wasn't just alive, it was something much darker. We arrived around sunset, the sky streaked with fiery reds and deep purples. The air smelled of fried dough and grease, and the faint sound of calliope music floated through the air, whimsical yet slightly out of tune. I remember feeling a twinge of unease as we walked through the gates. The ticket vendor barely looked at us, his hollow eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. His hand trembled as he handed me my stub, mumbling something I couldn't quite catch. "What did he say?" I asked my friend Clara. "Probably just carnival gibberish," she said with a shrug. But her voice was tight, like she was trying to convince herself. The crowd was thinner than I remembered from past years. The usual laughter and chatter seemed muted, replaced by the creak of old rides and the low hum of machinery. It felt like we'd stepped into a different world, one that wasn't entirely friendly. The main attraction was a new ride called the Grinning Maze. It was all anyone could talk about in school that week. They said it wasn't just a haunted house or some cheap fun house. It was an experience. Not for the faint of heart, the posters warned. That only made us more eager to try it. The entrance was a massive clown face, its painted smile stretched impossibly wide. The eyes glinted with a strange, lifelike quality, and the way they followed you felt intentional. A barker stood at the door, a tall man in a tattered ringmaster suit. His voice was deep and slow, each word dripping with mockery. "Step right up, brave souls. Dare to face your deepest fears. Enter if you must, but don't say I didn't warn you." I hesitated, but Clara grabbed my hand. "Come on, it's just a ride." Inside, the air grew colder, and the noise from the carnival outside faded to a dull murmur. The maze wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting distorted, nightmarish versions of ourselves. Shadows flitted in the corners, and faint whispers echoed all around us. It felt as if the maze were alive, shifting and breathing in sync with our steps. At first, we laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. But as we moved deeper, the laughter died. The mirrors began to show things that weren't there, at least not physically. Clara's reflection smiled at her, even when she wasn't smiling. I saw myself in one mirror, but my reflection had black, empty eyes. And the longer I stared, the more it began to move on its own, tapping on the glass as if trying to get out. "Let's turn back," I whispered. But when we turned around, the path was gone. The entrance was gone. Only more mirrors stretched before us. Then we heard the laugh. It was deep, guttural, and nothing like the cheerful giggles you'd expect in a fun house. It reverberated through the air, this one making the ground feel unsteady beneath us. We clung to each other, trying to find the source, but the maze was playing tricks. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Clara screamed first. A hand, pale, clawed, and impossibly long, reached out from one of the mirrors, grabbing her wrist. She yanked it back, but the hand didn't let go. I pulled at her, screaming her name, but it was like the hand had no weight, no mass, and yet it was stronger than both of us combined. As I tugged, I saw a figure emerging from the glass. A man, or something that used to be a man. His face was painted like a clown's, but the makeup was smeared, revealing decaying skin beneath. His grin was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear, his teeth jagged and yellowed. "Run!" Clara shrieked. I didn't want to leave her, but when the clown thing turned its empty eyes on me, I bolted. I ran through the maze, every turn leading to more mirrors, more distorted reflections. My own face stared back at me, twisted with fear, but in one mirror, it wasn't me. It was Clara, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving as if she were screaming, but no sound came out. I kept running until I stumbled into a small room at the center of the maze. The walls were bare, save for a single mirror that stretched from floor to ceiling. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then my reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that I wasn't making. It stepped out of the mirror. I froze as it stood before me, identical in every way except for its eyes. They were black pits, glinting with malice. It tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then it spoke. "You don't belong here." Its voice was mine, but distorted, layered with something ancient and cruel. I tried to back away, but the walls closed in, leaving me trapped with my doppelganger. It reached out, its fingers impossibly cold as they brushed against my arm. Pain shot through me, and I looked down to see dark veins spreading beneath my skin, like ink bleeding through paper. Your turn, it whispered, and then it stepped back into the mirror. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was in that room, and the next I was outside, sprawled on the cold grass of the fairgrounds. The carnival was gone. No lights, no rides, no people. Just an empty field under a starless sky. I found Clara a week later, or at least what was left of her. She was in the mirror section of an old antique shop downtown. Her reflection stared at me, her eyes pleading, her mouth moving in silent screams. I begged the shop owner to break the mirror, but he just shook his head. Can't break what's already been claimed, he said. Now I see her everywhere. In store windows, in puddles, even in the reflection of my own eyes. And sometimes, when the room is quiet, I hear the laughter, the same guttural, bone-chilling laugh from the maze. It's getting louder, closer. I don't know how much time I have left, but if you see a carnival roll into town with its bright lights and twisted grins, don't go. No thrill is worth what waits inside.